Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's session on cost-effective talent, exploring emerging talent hubs. This event, it's part of the SHRM webcast series. You can learn about upcoming and on-demand events from our e-newsletters and the webcast homepage at shrm.org/webcasts. SHRM thanks Multiplier for sponsoring this program and our series of free webcasts for the HR community. And now a little about today's program, where you will learn about how to tap into skilled and cost-effective talent pools, how to evaluate the ROI of talent expansion, and successful navigation of regulatory landscapes. I'm pleased to introduce our first presenter, Lena Sachs, Senior Vice President of Operations at Multiplier. Ms. Sachs has 19 years of experience in the employer of record and global payroll space. Likewise, let's now hand off to Ms. Sachs to get today's session underway and introduce you to today's other featured presenter. Lena, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tony. Pleasure to be here, and thanks for SHRM for hosting and allowing us to speak here today as Multiplier. I'm very honored and humbled to be speaking here today with Amrit. Amrit is one of the founders of Multiplier, and he is a leader that I definitely look up to, and I'm excited to speak to and ask some of these very, very pointed and important conversations as it relates to employment in today's world and in today's global environment. So thank you, Amrit, for letting me be your co-host today, and thanks for joining the session. Great. So let's begin with the first question. So Amrit, do tell us why there is a need to explore talent pools outside of the U.S.
Thank you so much, Lena, and thank you so much, Tony, for letting us be on this show today. Very excited to share what we have learned over the last few years at Multiplier with the wider audience. Just would like to take a step back and understand the key economic drivers that we are seeing today in the United States. Inflation has gone pretty high. And at the same time, as you can imagine, the sort of political concerns that the government has had with China, for instance, has also meant that importing a lot of goods from other countries has become a little bit more expensive for the population here in the United States. Now, we are effectively importing inflation because of these kind of trade concerns. Similarly, wages have also shot through the roof over the last 5 to 7 years, mainly because there is what we call a talent crunch in the United States. A talent crunch by no means that the US market has no talent. It just means that we will end up having to pay more for the incremental resource that we need. And bearing that in mind, what we are seeing today is that talent has become a lot more expensive across all levels, and specifically at the junior and mid-market. 10 years ago, you would go out to the market and hire a VP or a SVP, and the wages were 300,000, 350,000. Today, you go out to the market and you hire VP, SVP, it will still be fairly much consistent. But at the lower levels, where work actually needs to get done, where resourcing requirements are significantly higher, we see wages going very much higher. And this is predominantly driven because the US has got less talent than it needs. Very simply put, if you see software engineers, for instance, the average software engineer wage today is about 150,000 USD. It was significantly lower 10 years ago. And this is mainly because everybody is fighting for the same number of talent. So, bearing all of these factors in mind, what is occurring today, along with the rise of wage, is that, your rents are also going up. Now, what is happening is that within the United States itself, the market is paying more for people's rent than people's wage. What does that mean? If you pay somebody $200,000 in New York, you can be very certain that at least 60% of their person's wage is going to their rent. So we as businesses are footing the bill for a lot of these kind of additional factors rather than paying for the skills that we need. So hence, as a business, we have to consider talent across a much wider geography in order to continue doing what we need to do and in order to get access to the talent that we need today. And this is fundamentally the point that we're trying to drive to the market, that, hey, wages are going up, work still needs to get done, and at the same time, payroll budgets are increasing at the same rate, So what do? We are all in a little bit of a conundrum because we are a little bit stuck. And what has also been quite interesting is that over the last 20, 30 years, you see very large enterprises. You look at your American Express, your Visa, etc. They have been able to successfully get access to talent across the world. It's not a surprise that these guys have an office in Mexico, Philippines, India, etc. And they are also staying ahead of the curve. Twitter has now looked at opening offices in Africa. All of this is to get access to talent across the world and take advantage of, shall I say, wage arbitrage. So today, we want to identify, where these talent pools are, how we can get access to that, how you can evaluate your ROI on that, and lastly, how to navigate the complexities of engaging with these talent pools. I hope that answers it, Lena.
Well, it kind of then trickles to more questions, doesn't it? Right. So tell me, what are the different types of global talent acquisitions that we see out there?
So in terms of talent acquisition strategies that companies apply, they would either do it in a gradual manner, or they would do it in a combined deployment. What that means is that organizations can say, hey, this is our new policy. Everybody has got to get this done right now. That obviously is a little bit of a pain. Very difficult to implement, establish. Learning curves may not be the same, and hence, the other method, which is your gradual deployment, is something that we would recommend. I.e., if your organization is considering with engaging, resources outside of your home state, how you should get about them is obviously try. You have to try within a small number so that you also at the same time mitigate your risk. You don't want to take a step that the whole organization is not ready for. Start with 1, start with 2 resources. And similarly, talking about going global, talent pools, etc., very often I get posed by organizations, yes, we want to start looking at talent pools across the world. What should I do? The easiest way is there's Canada. Canadian wages are 20-30% lower than the United States. You don't necessarily need to look at a country where you're immediately getting access to 80% reduction in wages, as you would do in certain markets, across Asia and then Eastern Europe. So a gradual deployment is the most, I would say, sensible way of getting accustomed to this, getting the organization around it, and then understanding and calculating the ROI in a much more pointed and systematic manner. That would be, something that is very critical in deploying this in a successful manner.
I personally have also had success with that too. And I think it depends on roles too, from a gradual standpoint. Maybe you can test it based on certain functions within your business, try 1 and 2. Maybe some roles make more sense to look to gradually roll out globally versus some make more sense maybe to keep associated where headquarters is and such. And, I've even actually in my past life had the experience of moving, gradually, but then ending up having 60 to 70% of my workforce being global and then the rest being at HQ because it's been so successful. So I think gradual is a safer bet. That's more conservative.
Absolutely, Lena. So Actually, there were some very interesting examples that we identified. One good example that I can share is that, in Vietnam itself, a software engineer that doesn't speak English takes home approximately 40% less than a peer that speaks English, because the person that speaks English is so much more exportable. Now, what we have then identified and understood is that the organizations that have built successful software engineering teams in Vietnam have started by hiring someone at a manager or director level who is English speaking, and then subsequently over a period of time, then hiring the individual contributors under that individual. So that ensures that, the entire program is successful. They also then get access to, significant savings in terms of deploying an engineering team in an offshore market. When also looking at the different functions that you have highlighted, thanks for sharing that. It's really true, because it's also highly dependent on what sort of talent is available in the market that you are catering for. For example, when we talk to a sales leader, does he want everybody to be in the market or offshore? They would prefer a model in which, the most of the team, up to 100% of the team, is in market. But when you're talking to a CTO, they would suddenly prefer, they would prefer it if maybe 20% remains in market and 80% is offshore talent. Your customer success or your customer support leaders may prefer 100% offshore model, in order to get access to the people or the headcount needs that they need to execute his function well. So all of these different functional leaders will need to consider how best to deploy their offshore and inshore ratios to build a successful department or function.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, Tony, I think this may be a good time to poll the audience. What do you think?
Lena, I think that's a great idea. So with that, we are going to open a poll so that we can encourage some discussion between our presenters and our audience. And we'd like to ask, have you considered hiring internationally? Have you considered expanding, looking at different talent pools? So we're going to give you a handful of seconds to take a look, think about that question, so that you can indicate where you fall on that question. And so I guess, Henri, let me ask you, what are some reasons to or to not hire internationally, just as we give our audience just a moment to answer that poll question?
No, thank you so much. I think the major point is, are your company's budgets or payroll budgets, that flexible, in order to ignore this topic completely. At the end of the day, as we go into budget and planning period at the year end, everyone has lofty goals for 2024, and at the same time, the budgets are not lofty. Everyone has got to make do with having the same payroll cost, marginal increases for inflation, and everyone expects significant productivity gains for every single department. If you look at organizations, it's very much the case as that, status quo is not acceptable. So that is the major thing that, all organizations and business leaders need to take into account.
Thanks for that thoughtful reply, Henri. Let's take a look at our poll results.
Oh, interesting.
Interesting. It's very interesting. Most of my career, if not all of my career, has been expanding internationally and working with international teams. So I would definitely fall into the yes bucket personally. So it's interesting, right? Something to consider. Yeah. Moving on. Amrit, speaking of, talent and these types of different roles that we just talked about, but what do you think are the most common types of outsourced talent?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lena, for putting that across. I wanted to take a couple of minutes to, delve a little bit deeper into some of these terminologies that the industry may throw around. Typically, outsourcing is a function that is done where, you basically pass on the buck to an external organization. Outsourcing your customer support team or your sales function is a very risky maneuver, because no one knows whether that other business will be successful. That is not what we are trying to propagate. We basically want to speak of offshoring, starting with a nearshore strategy, i.e., there is a large amount of talent in Canada, Mexico, Brazil, as well as Eastern Europe, Asia Pacific. And we want organizations to engage with individuals across the world in order to optimize their budgets and their payroll costs. Now, when looking at talent pools, whether outsourced, offshored, etc., we have a lot of very strong leading indicators. Again, American Express has a huge customer support team in Mexico. That tells you that there is a good enough talent pool over there, to go after. Now, bearing that in mind, what can be offshored? I mean, to be honest with you, we do have a website link that everyone has access to. Is if you just Google multiplier talent trends, you will get access to a website that shows you the top 5 countries in which United States-based businesses are employing in. It will tell you what job functions it is in that they are hiring for, as well as how much they are paying for the talent and how that talent was found. The world today is so much more democratized than 10 years ago. Prior to LinkedIn entering the space, it was impossible to get engaged or get in touch with someone sitting in a different state, let alone a different country. Today, most of your working professionals across the world are on LinkedIn in some shape or form, especially your white-collar jobs. So as we look at what are the white-collar jobs that can be offshored, we see a very significant amount of interest in your customer support roles. Your customer support roles are extremely, shall I say, efficient and cost efficient also in your major markets like Philippines, Mexico, India, and Africa in certain countries, specifically Nigeria and Kenya. And the other very, I would say, common roles that we see are your IT support specialists, your HR admin staff, payroll clerks, junior bookkeepers, personal assistants, data entry roles, as well as a lot of marketing specific roles such as your web design, social media, as well as your junior sales functions, especially your BDRs and SDRs. So we see roles being offshored across the board. I would not say that any particular function cannot be offshored today, because we see this happening everywhere.
Thanks for that. Definitely. Definitely we see it in our client base, that's for sure. And it's ever evolving, right? I hate to bring back, but with COVID and such and what we experienced a few years back, it really opened up the world for everyone. I think even more eye-opening to say we can work anywhere, right? We don't have to. I remember, even 10 years ago, you had to live and work in the same place that, you were taxed at, that your company was at. Everything had to be there and you commuted into work to do it. And I think really the phenomenon changed, I would say, drastically 3-4 years ago. And it was very eye-opening that any job, pretty much as you just rightfully stated, can be done remotely, right? And can be offshored or onshored or nearshored. It's really proven itself out. So I think that's very valid. Thanks for sharing. What implications should U.S. businesses take into account when considering whether to nearshore, offshore this type of talent?
Certainly. Thank you, Lina. I think the few main considerations are, let me start off by saying, what exactly is the role defined as? So if it's a junior, entry-level individual contributor role in which the task can be very specifically laid out, because the company's processes are already working in a very strong manner, that is definitely, I would say, a key consideration. Now, what are the implications for the US-based businesses is that, that you will get access to a very strong talent pool that you can leverage off and see a very strong ROI in terms of, cost benefit. I don't know how to say this, but a customer service rep in United States would be at least on 50,000 per annum. You take that to a country like Philippines, you're looking at approximately 12,000 per annum. That is a phenomenal difference. It's too big to ignore, and that's why this topic is so critical today. But if you're trying to understand what is the real implication on the US businesses when offshoring, is that compliance and regulations. Are you going to do it yourself, or do you need the assistance of someone? And I think this is a commonly misunderstood topic that the world has not necessarily spent enough time on. Let me give you an example. 20 years ago, any US-based business, looking to expand mainly for sales reasons, would say, hey, we need to hire a sales director in UK. It's the most common market to expand to, because there's the dream of getting access to Europe. And what they would do is that the automatic, shall I say, reaction is to open up a legal entity in the United Kingdom. Simply because that was what is commonly known, and that also comes at the advice of accountants and lawyers. Is that the right thing to do for the business? That may not be the case. Businesses need to understand and basically differentiate between the objective of going global versus why you're opening up a legal entity. And I don't think enough thought has been put into it for this specific purpose. So getting access to new tools and technologies that are also scalable and cost-effective, such as our own solution, gives businesses the opportunity today to identify why they are looking to open an entity and how to get about doing it. So if organizations recognize that compliance is something they don't want to dabble with on their own, the option to get access to the market without the compliance headaches is broadly available in today's space. So that is something that I think it's worth highlighting and sharing in more detail later on also.
I mean, I think that brings up a very valid point, is compliance is a big word. It means a lot of things. A lot of companies fear it, and rightfully so, because they want to do what's right for their brand, their reputation, their employees, their customers, etc. I guess, what are your recommendations on how companies should navigate through compliance and all these local requirements?
Absolutely. So I think what everybody would do is the same advice that I have. In order to navigate compliance, we get in touch with a local lawyer, a local accountant. And what we do is, we set up a local legal entity with our, a corporate secretary. They would then set up the necessary registration with the government bodies. Your local lawyers would set up your employment contracts. Your accountants would help with setting up a local payroll. All of that is just the setup. Then there's, of course, the headache of continuous compliance. And that is the part that scares people more. And it's what organizations are a lot more apprehensive about, which is why, today, if you go to if any department leader wanted to expand and think about going global, they would bring up that topic to the CFO or to their head of legal and be like, hey, I need to hire someone in Canada. They immediately get laughed out the door. Nobody wants to take that risk. It's headaches. It's not easy, and it exposes an organization to country risk. So in terms of, identifying what they should do, the most important thing to do is to bear in mind that today we can demarcate compliance and outsource the compliance element to organizations like ours, Multiplier, and treat expansion in a different lens altogether. So that is something that we want to ensure that everyone is familiar with.
Yeah, that makes sense. Relying on the experts or so to be able to take on that compliance and manage that compliance going forward. I mean, I think, definitely all the lawyers and accountants will tell you that you're set up in a compliant fashion and it's done, but definitely managing and maintaining it is the part that gets tricky, because past those lawyers and accountants who holds that expertise, right? But the experts themselves. So very valid. Tony, maybe we can do another poll right now.
That sounds great, Lena. So, yep, let's take a look at our next poll question. And we are going to ask if you are interested in a user-friendly solution for effectively hiring and collaborating with global talent. We're going to give everyone some privacy here, just to make sure that everyone feels comfortable answering this question. So let's get that poll on the screen as just toggling my windows here. Let's have that poll question on the screen. And while our audience is answering that question, let's start with you, Amrit. What's your origin story? How did you end up in the global employment space?
Thank you so much, Tony. Maybe I should have started with that. So just a bit of background. So I started off as an auditor in KPMG in London. So very much focused on the compliance. And then I found my way to Robert Walters and Korn Ferry, which are large recruitment and staffing firms. And I think what came out was that I'm originally from Singapore, and just to be more factual, in Singapore itself, we have a base population of a million working professionals. And at the same time, we also have an additional 1.2 million people that are also working professionals on short-term and long-term work visas. So Singapore as a country is insanely reliant on importing talent as a strategy to grow to grow the GDP. We see the exact same behaviors in other developed countries. You look at UK, US, Germany, France, Japan, Korea. Everyone has got the same underlying strategy. The only way they can grow the GDP is to import more people, simply because at the end of the day, these countries have, including Singapore, have a very slowly growing local population, i.e. birth rates are not as high as they would like it to be. So my origin story is very much a case of understanding what are the major talent supply and demand imbalances, and then identifying ways and means in which we can directly impact this. And happy to share that since we launched Multiplier, the demand from the market has been incredibly high. We don't necessarily need to convince people that they need to do something about it. Organizations very much see it themselves. And if you look at a market in like United States today, in 2023, the US market needed approximately 1 million software engineers. And the country is also, I would say, importing approximately 80,000 to 90,000 H-1B green card visa holders to take on those jobs. Now, there is still a very large shortage of talent that the country needs. And what people are doing about it is that they are essentially just having to pay more for the people that are already here. So you still see a lot of wage inflation in that specific job function. Hope that shared.
Thanks for sharing, Amrit. Lena, how about you? With 19 years of experience in the employer of record and global payroll space, so how'd you land here, and what keeps you coming back?
I'm very passionate about international business and the international space. Like I said, my entire career, close to 20 years, has been in international payroll and EOR. I love working with talent all over the world. I think I've had the opportunity, I should say, to do a lot of incredible things with a lot of incredible talent in my career. I landed at a startup that when global payroll was just kind of scratching the surface, so to speak. And I was able to successfully scale that business to then be acquired by ADP. I then, worked at ADP, launching products and leading a service line for that division for several years, and kind of got into employer of record, which was getting hot somewhere around that time. And it's kind of the way I look at global employer of record. It's like a distant cousin to payroll, because in the end, we still pay people internationally. In the EOR space, we're just making sure that we're compliant and signing them on, not as full-time FTEs, but as employers of record, so to speak. And kind of been in that space ever since. I do think that helping companies hire internationally unlocks a lot of potential for organizations that they may not know may have existed. I do, like I said, I think the last couple of years have been very telling in that space, and there's a lot of opportunities for companies to scale, to better themselves, to be more compliant, and to save costs and ensure that they're meeting that growth trajectory that everybody needs to continue to meet, as Amrit rightfully pointed out at the beginning, through this type of working arrangement. And like I said, I myself have benefited from it, and also have been able to help customers in that space as well. So I'm very passionate about it. Thanks for asking, Tony.
You got it, Lena. And actually, one more bedrock question. Could you define what employer of record means? You've alluded to it and said a bit about it, but just could you provide our audience with the, that bedrock understanding so that they can extrapolate for all of your great insights today?
Sure. I should be testing you, Tony, in this question now, if you're paying attention. Employer of record is basically, we help organizations hire talent locally in a compliant manner. We hire them on contractually as our employees in a particular country based on the proper setup in a particular location. And then we facilitate the onboarding for these employees, as well as the life cycle of their journey with that company. And then we also then help offboard those employees when the time is right for that particular client in that country in the most compliant and ethical way possible for that customer.
Thorough response, Lena. And so after that, after hearing your great origin stories and our audience answering that poll, let me hand back to you to continue with this. We have Amrit in the hot seat.
Yeah, I thought we were going to go through our second poll. Did you want to read the results of the second poll?
So we're actually giving folks a little bit of grace and privacy on that one. Yeah. So, but thanks for that. Great.
Okay. Makes sense. All right. Amrit. So what are we talked a lot about compliance and making sure that we're compliant, and we all want to make sure we're all compliant, right? But what happens when, there's failure to be compliant globally? And what are some downsides in failing to be compliant globally, especially when you're hiring global talent?
No, thank you so much, Lena. Compliance is one of those terms that gives everyone the heebie-jeebies. But let's just try to break it down. Sorry for the language, but let's try to break it down. So there are a few things. Of course, the major thing is compliance is binary. There is no such thing as being 95 to 99% compliant. You're either compliant or you're not. Secondly, we then have to identify what are the risks of non-compliance. Of course, a reputational risk for an organization is there. Is that something that is easily quantifiable? I'm not certain. But what we do have is, quantifiable non-compliance markers, which is very simple. If you don't pay, for example, for citing Vietnam, so if you don't pay an employee on time by the 7th of the following month in Vietnam, a company just gets fined $2,000 USD per headcount. Compliance is usually, so that's what it means. Compliance is very binary, very quantifiable, and it just means a lot of financial penalties for an organization. Now, what is the cost of maintaining the compliance is something that, we also want to talk about. How much are we paying a legal expert to be on top of these things in Vietnam? How much are we paying the payroll partners, the accounting firms, etc., in order to maintain that level of compliance in a particular market. And lastly, there are also certain issues that may arise. For example, in some markets, if an organization is not compliant, what happens is that then the organization can also face bans on taking on resources for a period of time. Now, all of that has got a lot of business risk. Needless to say, no one wants to have their hands tied in their game of how they want to grow their revenues, right, at the end of the day, and improve their bottom line. So compliance typically just means that, what are the challenges that we need to overcome? What are the compliance challenges? How much it costs to overcome them? And what the organization can do in order to find the best way possible to proceed. And more often than not, it's very useful and critical to identify that, I think we were discussing the EOR mechanism. How does that change from an outsourcing mechanism? An outsourcing mechanism not only outsources the compliance, it also outsources the business outcome. I.e., if you're outsourcing an IT project, that other company is responsible for the success of the IT project. That, of course, carries a lot more business risk, and it's also a much more costly endeavor. You are not going to get away with a cost-effective solution. Now, if we are just able to pinpoint and outsource compliance, now that is exactly what businesses need today, because all organizations have access to enough skills on their team to not outsource the problem. All organizations also have access to talent pools across the world. Like I said, thanks to LinkedIn. All organizations have access to video recording facilities like we are doing right now. Now, what does that mean is that all organizations now have access to people across the world. They can be found. And the missing piece is, how do we engage with this talent across the world in a cost-effective and scalable manner that also mitigates your risk, right? So this is where organizations in the EOR space like Multiplier come in and help companies engage with people across the world.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. So we've talked about how, like, at the front end, right, you're making sure that you're compliant. But once an employee is hired, actually under this model, how do we then ensure that the employment is compliant going forward?
Very, very, very loaded question. Of course, we take on that risk, right, for organizations.
Yes.
And I think that is exactly what businesses pay us to do. There are a lot of checks and balances in place. We do our KYC and our KYB checks, basic right to work. We also have a whole host of, insurances in place with, professional indemnity, public liability insurance. All of this is designed to ensure that, your average on board in a foreign country can be done in a compliant manner, and at the same time protects the company from taking on any risk in a particular market. So that's what Multiplier is there to do, and that's our bread and butter.
Makes sense, definitely. So, we talked about compliance a lot, and why to source talent internationally. But can you maybe share with the audience what are some great locations that we've seen our customers find success in hiring international talent, and maybe building off of that, maybe some roles that you've seen successful as well?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. That's one of my favorite topics. So in terms of compliant onboarding, what does that mean? There is this EOR mechanism is the only compliant onboarding mechanism outside of what is typically involved in opening up your own legal entity today in the market. There is also a third option, which is getting in touch with staffing agencies, which we will touch on later, because those solutions are not fully scalable and cost effective. So in terms of engaging with people across the world, specific to the United States today, as well as to our customers in Canada, for instance, we find that there is a lot more interest in talent pools in Western Europe, specifically UK, Eastern Europe, specifically UK for your sales, marketing type roles, your Eastern Europe for, I would say, mainly your technology roles, as well as India and Philippines for a broader range of roles. India being a lot more for technology, Philippines being significantly higher for recruiting, sales, marketing, customer support. Which brings us to Latin America. What's going on there? So we don't see the same amount of interest in Latin American markets, predominantly due to two reasons. Firstly, the English-speaking capabilities are not as high as some of these other markets today. And that, we hope, changes over the next 5 years or so. I think local governments are putting in more efforts to ensure that their population is much more well-versed in English. Secondly, there is a little bit of a secondary issue with respect to Latin American markets and how United States businesses can engage with them. And this has got to do with the currency fluctuations that a lot of these markets see. And because these markets have got such fluctuating currencies, we often find local talent pools not being interested in getting a local peso or Brazilian real contract. And now when these individuals want to be paid in US dollars, then all of a sudden, compliance becomes a question mark. And then it basically limits the ability of United States businesses to engage with individuals in a lot of these markets.
And I know you had mentioned it before, but the cost savings, what is the actual cost benefit for these types of roles? I mean, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but beyond maybe even the cost benefit, what are other benefits that you think the audience should be aware of when hiring internationally?
Absolutely. I think this taking into account, your software engineer roles, which is, I would just say, one of the most common ones. In the United States, your average software engineer is earning 150,000 USD. In the UK, they would be on about 100,000 USD. You take that same talent skill level to Eastern Europe, you'll be looking at 70. You take it to India, it will also be around the same. And in Philippines, it would be about 40,000. So all of a sudden, things, specifically change in very quantifiable manner. If you're looking at customer support roles, then you're talking about 80% difference in terms of a skilled professional in the US versus Mexico. I mean, of course, the major challenges, of course, are time zones that everyone has to be cognizant of, and which is why, the Canadian market is by far the most conveniently located and, skilled workforce that the United States businesses can tap into. And there are minimal cultural issues, very little confusion about, what's expected of individuals, and overall. But I think what we want to also share with all the businesses on our call today is that, as we look on a global talent perspective, we start seeing that in some markets, the resources are just a lot more plugged in. You go to Western Europe, in some markets, you would be amiss if you would send an email to someone in France or Spain after 5 p.m., right? People are scared of that. And then at the same time, you don't have those concerns when you're employing in Philippines or Mexico. In a lot of markets, people are just a little bit hungrier, more driven, and keen to progress. So you start seeing a lot more ROI than what is necessarily written on paper.
Makes sense. Maybe this is a good time to do our third poll. Tony, what do you think?
I think that sounds great, Lena. So we are going to bring our third poll question on, and we're going to ask, hey, would you like to explore strategies for global hiring with Multiplier's team? We're going to give everyone little bit of time to answer that question. And let me toss a question your way, Amrit. I believe earlier you mentioned that you offered the suggestion of offering a legal entity in the UK. What do you tell me about that? What are the benefits of doing so in the UK? Why the UK? What are those benefits?
So basically, I mean, I would not say that there is a benefit to opening a legal entity anywhere in the world. This idea of opening a legal entity is, I would say, comes with a lot more compliance headaches than business benefits. So the narrative is changing, and the narrative has to change. So businesses should open up legal entities, especially when there are two very explicit reasons. Number one, they are bidding for government contracts. There are almost no two ways about it. And secondly, we also find businesses that are, I would say, B2C. Think about Netflix and Spotify. Those kind of businesses, in order to penetrate a market, need to open up a legal entity in a particular country so that they can start invoicing in a local currency, and then the payments, etc., all become a lot more convenient. So outside of that, businesses should defray their decision-making horizon on opening legal entities until they are absolutely certain about a country. And this level of certainty needs to be taken into account, that in order to close a legal entity, be it UK, Germany, France, India, Philippines, it will take a business 3 years. So that level of pain is another topic that we have not actually specifically delved into, but that has been seen by so many businesses across the world. Everybody has tried to close down a legal entity, suddenly comes to us and say, hey, I wish we knew about you guys, because then we would not have taken that decision so lightly, and we would have put a lot more thought into this process.
Thank you, Amrit. Just as we're beginning to head towards the end of the hour, we do want to make sure that we have time for questions that have been coming in from our audience. So we are going to take a moment before we turn to those questions, and share that this program is sponsored by Multiplier. Multiplier's employer of record solution is an all-in-one global workforce management platform designed to help businesses compliantly and quickly onboard, pay, and manage a workforce across more than 150 countries. With Multiplier, companies can save costs while meeting their growth targets and set up in minutes to ensure a positive employee experience. Multiplier is a dependable partner with more than 100 local experts. They have a dedicated customer success team available 24 hours a day, 5 days a week, are a top-rated employer of record on G2, and are ranked as number 1 on most implementable among 50 other players on the G2. Learn more by visiting usemultiplier.com. So let's turn now to some questions that have been coming in for our audience. And an audience member asks, Amrit, do you have any suggestions for government organizations whose roles they're hiring for require a government clearance?
No, thank you so much, Tony. So yes, we do work with a number of organizations that are government organizations. And some of these roles do require government clearance. And the basic reality is that the clearance check will occur in the exact same manner if this person was your direct employee. There is no difference in terms of compliance requirements. And when it comes to onboarding, we are able to facilitate the full variety of, criminal, educational background checks to ensure that, the clearance requirements can be met.
For that answer, Amrit. Amrit, another member of our audience asks, as you mentioned, there is a cost savings for tapping into talent across the UK, Western Europe, and Asia. But since Canada is closer and makes sense to utilize, what's the cost savings leveraging talent in Canada for some of these roles that you've mentioned?
No, with Canada, I mean, the basic thing is Canadian cost of living is already so much lower than the United States today. You look at their oil, the energy prices, the food prices, their rents, etc. It's very evident that Canada is a much cheaper place to live in compared to almost any state in the United States. So exactly, you will at least see 20 to 40% in terms of cost savings on a lot of wages. For example, take into a customer success manager role. In the United States, you would pay $120,000 USD very comfortably. In Canada, you would comfortably get someone on 70 to 80,000. USD. So overall, I would say every single job function, you would be able to find someone in Canada, and you would be able to land at, on average, 30% less than US. From an accountant to someone in marketing to someone in sales, across the board.
Thank you, Amrit. Amrit, another member of our audience asks, if I've initiated international hiring, how do I subsequently measure or determine if it's going well or not so well?
I see. No, so I mean, the important thing about a EOR function is that we are a compliance outsourcing mechanism. You know, how well that person performs is going to be left to the individual hiring managers and who that person reports to. So you would follow your same performance appraisal mechanisms. You would incorporate these individuals in the same way you would treat anybody in your organization, and you would be able to gauge that, taking into account, time zones, their working capabilities, their skills, etc. I hope that helps.
That sure does, Amrit. Amrit, so a topic that's come up in our discussion today is navigating cultural differences. So I guess how do you prep your organization for that? Do you put together sort of a binder on do's and don'ts for your international employees? Like how do you navigate these cultural differences that do come up at work?
No, I mean, quick highlight is that you would be surprised at how many people in the world work for American-based businesses. Like I shared, American Express has been warming up the Mexican market for years. So you don't necessarily need to worry about cultural differences, because every company has their own specific company culture. What we specifically do on our end is that we are very concise in terms of sharing what the goals and the roles and responsibilities are for every single hire that we make. I.e., we document everything. We use simple, straightforward English because somebody maybe it could be English, could be their second language, and as much as possible, we take a lot more efforts to communicate as clearly as we can with individuals across the company.
Thanks, Amrit. A question for each of you now. And what's the most surprising thing you've learned or run into when it comes to the field of employer record and international hiring? Either happened to you or learned.
Lena, go ahead. Or would you like me to?
You want me to go first? Oh, I got to think about this. Honestly, it's just quite amazing to me how my personal learning curve has never plateaued since I've been in the international space. And the reason is that every country has its own regulations. They change their rule sets and regulations quite often. And even within a country, depending on the province or the canton or the state or wherever you live, there could also be different employment rules associated with it. So, similar to how we have in the States where every state has its own, that is something that spreads contextually all over the world. So wherever we get into or whatever type of situation we have with an employee or an employer, you're always learning. And that's probably why I've stuck in this industry for so long, because I someone who enjoys learning, and the learning curve has not stopped. And I don't think it really ever will, because every year there's a new legislation change in some country or some state, shape, or form. So I wouldn't say it's just been a surprise, but it's definitely a rewarding learning experience for sure.
I think on my end is also very much the same. But I think what I wanted to highlight is that this is not something new. 20 years ago, before EOR became a commonly used term, if someone in US wanted to compliantly engage with somebody in UK or Singapore or Japan or even Mexico, they could easily do so, and this was facilitated by staffing agencies, your Robert Half's and Kelly and Manpower groups. You could contract someone in any part of maybe 40, 50 countries very conveniently 20 years ago. What was missing from that piece is that those solutions aren't necessarily scalable and cost effective. And that's why the existing, solutions that we have allows organizations to do this in a much more scalable, cost-effective manner so that it can permeate and be used across the organization and not just for very, very specific, shall I say, senior appointments.
Thank you, Amrit. And let's close on this big question that's come in from a viewer. And that is, what else are you, so you have your perspective at Multiplier. What else are you seeing what trends are you seeing in the employment of record and international hiring, arena, so to say? What are the current ebbs and flows? Also, where do we not want it to go? And finally, where do you want it to go and why?
Absolutely. I think the biggest challenge for the employer of record space is very much getting the market to be aware of how useful and necessary it is. I say useful because, every organization needs it. They just need to identify when it is necessary. And more often than not, these payroll costs, payroll budgets, etc., need some sort of a leeway because, if nothing is done about the American population today, then you will systematically still keep seeing wage inflation over the next 10, 15 years. And that basically still affects the population here. Companies, the people in the companies need to continuously push the agenda to make the American businesses much more competitive on a global landscape. And that's something that, I just thought it was worth sharing.
Lena, anything to add on that one before we wrap up?
No, but I want to know what Amrit's answer is to the last question you raised. Where would you want to go if you can go work anywhere, Amrit?
No, I think he was asking where the EORs.
Lena, I love your spin on this question, actually. Where would you want to work, Amrit?
No, I wouldn't. I can't go anywhere else. I'm too passionate about what we are doing.
No, he meant what I was teasing when I meant what country you would like to work in. That was the joke.
Country, yeah. I'm still looking at Mexico, though.
Okay. Very nice. Yeah, very nice.
Very nice. With that, folks, we are going to begin to bring today's webcast to a close. Before we sign off, we'd like to close with some words of gratitude. First, to our presenters, Lena Sachs and Amrit Singh in Multiplier. We thank them for all of the excellent insight and thought leadership they've shared today. Finally, and most importantly, we want to thank you, our audience, for your interest in this session and for choosing SHRM for HR Webcasts. That concludes today's program.